But the diplomatic effort to end the war in Ukraine is being stepped up, even as Russia continues its deadly bombardment. The sides are set to resume negotiations online tomorrow. Turkey says it's working to bring together the country's foreign ministers. While confidence is low about any major progress, more humanitarian corridors are being opened, with Moscow declaring a ceasefire in Mariupol to allow citizens there to evacuate.
Ukraine is bracing for fresh attacks in the country's east. President Volodymyr Zelensky has cast doubt that Russia is scaling down its operations, as it promised to do during negotiations this week.
Але також бачимо, що у цей же час відбувається накопичування російських військ для нових ударів на Донбасі. І до цього ми готуємось. Ми нікому не віримо у жодні красиві словесні конструкції. Є реальна ситуація на полі бою, і зараз це найголовніше. Ми нічого не віддамо і будемо боротися за кожен метр нашої землі, за кожну нашу людину.
There are growing indications that Russia's focus is turning to Ukraine's east. Troops are capturing more towns and cities in Donbas. The leader of the Donetsk region, part of Donbas, says Russia's assault has been intensifying. Despite having vowed to reduce military activity by a large margin, there's been no let-up to bombardments near Chernihiv and Kyiv. Ukraine says a lot of fighting continues around the capital. The mayor of Irpin says at least 200 people have been killed, while more than half of the town has been destroyed. There could be some hope for besieged Mariupol. Moscow has declared a local ceasefire to allow civilians to evacuate. Ukrainian authorities say they have sent dozens of buses to the port city to help people get out and to deliver much-needed humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, Western intelligence say Russia massively misjudged the situation in Ukraine. They have been keen to play up Moscow's failures in the war. Britain and the US suggest President Vladimir Putin is being misled by his own advisors.
And Julia Chapman joins us live from Moscow. Julia, peace talks set to resume tomorrow online. Are the two sides any closer to any form of agreement?
The Kremlin hasn't yet confirmed that the peace talks will go ahead tomorrow, but said they would update later if that is indeed the plan. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, also warned against viewing this week's talks in Istanbul as a breakthrough, saying that there is still a long way to go and quite a lot more work to be done between the two sides of negotiators. But we have been hearing from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who says that he sees some positive progress, some indication that there is an understanding from the Ukrainian side that the questions on the status of the eastern Donbas breakaway republics and the status of Russia-annexed Crimea are in fact closed. That hasn't been confirmed by the Ukrainian negotiators. They say that they are willing to consider a neutral status for Ukraine with security guarantees, but they also want a full withdrawal of all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory before any kind of peace treaty can come into effect. And at the moment, that is looking very unlikely indeed. Ukraine also wants to put this peace treaty, if it is signed, to a referendum. And of course, that could take quite a lot of time as well. Turkey, which is now trying to put itself forward as the main mediator in these talks, is pushing quite hard for a ministerial meeting between the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine at some point in the next 2 weeks in order to give more impetus to these peace talks. The Kremlin has said it is open to that idea, but there would need to be a substantive reason to hold that meeting.
Oh, Julia, in the meantime, Russia trying to ease the economic siege on it. Russia's been working on a plan for the payment of natural gas to be made in rubles. That's met with fierce opposition in Europe. Any update on that?
we're expecting the government to present a report on what this would look like. This is after President Vladimir Putin ordered his government to look into a demand that so-called unfriendly countries, namely the countries that have introduced sanctions against Russia, should have to pay for their energy contracts with Russian energy providers in rubles. Most of these contracts, almost all of them, in fact, are denominated in euros and dollars. And European nations say that would be a breach in the contracts. Analysts agree and say that if there were to be any kind of change in the currency used for these contracts, there would have to be a lengthy negotiation process, and that could take months or years. Now, the Kremlin has admitted that this would be a gradual process, somewhat rolling back after President Putin ordered Gazprom, Russia's biggest gas provider, to implement this as soon as possible. And we have heard today in the daily Kremlin press briefing that it is being considered a solution whereby Western nations would simply make the payment still in dollars or euros to a Russian bank, which would then convert the money into rubles before handing it over to the Russian suppliers. Now, that wouldn't change very much from the status quo. So it does appear that the Kremlin is stepping back on this somewhat. That also seems to be agreed upon by Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, who held a phone conversation with President Putin today. He suggested that there has been some reflection inside Russia as to how that would actually work. And he says right now there is no indication that energy supplies are at risk.
Oh, thanks for that update. Julia Chapman for us there in Moscow.
Now we go to Riga, Latvia. Ollie Barrett joins us live. Ollie, the US and the UK seem to have aligned in their view that President Putin has been misled by his advisors, who are somewhat afraid to tell him of how badly the war is going. What's the thinking behind this coordinated messaging and timing by Washington and London?
Yeah, it does seem that UK and US intelligence has really been in lockstep almost throughout this crisis. In the lead up to the invasion, it was the Americans and the British that were saying that their intelligence suggested an invasion was likely, was perhaps imminent. There were other Western capitals that weren't of the same view, and it was the Americans and the British that were proven to have the best intelligence there. And now the words that we're hearing from the UK spy chief and from the White House and the Pentagon are really very similar indeed. It does seem like this is a coordinated attempt to get a message out of some sort. One of the things that might be trying to be achieved by the Americans and the British here is to get a message to Vladimir Putin himself, to tell him that his military invasion is not perhaps going the way that he is being told by his own advisors. And one of the reasons for that would be what was articulated overnight by officials in Washington, which is that idea that if Vladimir Putin doesn't realize some of the difficulties that his military operation is having inside Ukraine, then he might be going into peace talks feeling he has a stronger hand than actually he does have. So perhaps that's one reason from the American and British perspective to try and get this message out there, to try and get it direct to Vladimir Putin himself, who they claim is not being properly informed.
On one hand, Russia has promised this week to scale back attacks near Lviv. On the other hand, heavy shelling continues on the ground. To what extent are such tactics affecting diplomatic negotiations?
Well, right after those talks in Turkey earlier this week, which seemed to make progress, there seemed to be positive signs coming out of them. But straight afterwards, we had a call between the leaders of the US, UK, France, Germany and Italy, expressing huge scepticism about Russian commitments that were made during those talks. And it does appear that even after Russia said that it would scale back military operations around Kiev, around Chernihiv, that actually military action has simply been continuing in those locations, even if there is a renewed focus on the east of the country as well, which is something that Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has been warning about. But Boris Johnson also speaking in very harsh terms after those rounds of peace talks in Turkey this week. He said plainly Vladimir Putin can't be trusted, absolutely saying that Russia would need to be judged on its actions, not its words. And we heard that said by US President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken as well. But the diplomacy continues nonetheless. Today, for example, we've had the Norwegian Prime Minister with an hour-long telephone call with Vladimir Putin, urging him to pull his troops out and end the war. The Prime Minister Støre of Norway saying after that call that he had limited expectations about what it may have achieved, but he says nothing should be left untried in the situation we are now in.
Okay, Ollie, leave it there for now. Ollie Barrett is in Riga, Latvia. We will go back to the Ukraine crisis, particularly from the city of Lviv, a little later in the show.